Well, I came back in late January of 1946, and I had the GI Bill of Rights opportunity. So I went to UCLA, and at that time, and I think it's still the law in California, if you were in the upper, then it was 12% of your class, you were automatically allowed to go to a University of California school. So I chose to go to UCLA, and I went there, and I showed them my high school record, and I was a straight A student in high school. So they accepted me, and I started at UCLA in March of 1946. As I indicated, I took senior status when my years of service, 13, and my age, 67, equal 80. When I was appointed, I was the first Hispanic judge in the Ninth Circuit. There was one other judge, Hispanic judge, who was senior to me in the Fifth Circuit. And that judge has long since retired. So I am now the senior United States Circuit judge who is Hispanic in the country. And I'm also one, I think one other judge, Judge Pregerson, who went to the same grammar school as I did, who is still an active judge in my court. And there's another senior judge who is in his 90s, who is 3 or 4 years older than I am. But I'm up there with the oldest group that's still serving. Judge Pregerson has refused to go senior. He's still an active judge, which means he sits full time. And you know, I say to people, what an incredible country this is. My grandfather came across the border with his family in the midnight train. My father had only 1 year of education. And here I have the good fortune of having at least 2 bachelor's degrees. I could have had a doctor of jurisprudence. And I have 3 children who all have graduate degrees because of this great country. I have 3 grandchildren, all girls, and a recent great-grandchild, who was a boy. When I got into law school in 1948, I had a wonderful uncle named Andres Seiss, who had been a baker, became a Boy Scout executive, and was the Boy Scout executive for East Los Angeles because he was bilingual and Hispanic. And he and his wife did an incredible job there. But with that job, he became acquainted with young people like Edward Roybal, and there were a number of young men like Congressman Roybal who were trying to help the people in East LA. At that time, there were no elected officials. And so people like Ed Roybal were doing social work and trying to get people registered, trying to develop them. So my uncle worked with them on his part-time. But as a Boy Scout executive, that threw him in to work with them. My uncle had a funny experience. He did such a good job in East Los Angeles that he was called by the head of the scouting movement and said, "We want to give you another challenge." And my uncle said, "What's that?" He said, "We're sending you to Watts to organize the African American community because we have few African American Boy Scouts." He said, "Can't you give a younger man these new challenges?" But he took the job and did the same kind of good work over in Watts for African American kids. So between my uncle's work and Congressman Roybal's work, I became very interested in East LA, but being in law school, I couldn't give much time. But I joined a group called the Mexican American Affairs Council. And although I was just a law student, I wrote the bylaws for it. And we had fundraisers and gathered money and started agitating with elected officials to change conditions in East Los Angeles. I was awarded the Purple Heart when I was still a PFC with my infantry unit outside of Trier, Germany. The job of a scout, as I think I indicated earlier, was to go first before the whole regiment, in my case, until the orders are you come in contact with the enemy. And I said, you mean until they start shooting at me? And he said, yeah, you can put it that way. So the captain of my company called me and he said, we were at the top of a valley. There was a wide U shape and it was covered with snow. And he said, I want you to go down to the middle of this valley and see where the Germans are located. And I said, Captain, if you look at the hill on the left and the hill on the right, if I were a German commander, I would put a machine gun on each of those hills and I would rake it across this valley. And he said, Private, you've received a direct order, and if you refuse a direct order in combat, where we are on the front lines, it's a death penalty offense. And I said, yes, sir. So I said, but please keep an eye on what's happening because I will bet you that they have machine guns there. So I ran out to the area where he sent me, and sure enough, a machine gun started firing on each side. And as I ran, I could see the bullets, tracer bullets, which you can see in daylight, going between my legs. So I looked ahead about 30 feet and I saw a depression in the snow. And so I raced to that and dove into it. What I didn't realize is it was a shell hole that was about 4 feet deep, and there was ice on top of it, and below that was more ice and ice water. So I sank into that. So I started to crawl out, and the two machine gunners deflected their weapons down, and they started sending bullets around my helmet. So I decided, I'm not going to leave here at daylight. So I was in that hole all day. Fortunately, there was a guy behind me, my second scout, who was from Wisconsin and knew about snow because I started to doze off. And that's one thing that happens when you are about to expire in the snow or drowning. You get into this lull that fortunately God sends us into that to make it easier to pass on. So I started to doze off and he kept yelling at me and he kept wrapping up snow around rocks and hitting me on the head to keep me awake, and he kept me awake all that day. When it got dark, and by the way, my captain, to use a military expression, he froze, literally, and did nothing. Didn't send artillery or mortar fire, so I was out there in front of the regiment. He moved the regiment to a forest to my right, and when it got dark and the machine gunners couldn't see me, I crawled out and I started running towards the forest because I could hear my troops over there. And it was the strangest experience because I couldn't feel anything below my hips. I was like Jackson the singer. I felt like I was doing that kind of a movement. So when I got there, two of the guys from northern United States said, what's happened to you? And I said, I can't feel anything on my legs. So they had me take my boots off, and they rubbed my legs all night. And they called for medics. So the next morning, I was taken to a hospital in Luxembourg, and they found out that my legs had been frozen from the hips down. So in the hospital, I was surrounded by other soldiers who had gone through a similar experience, many of whom had their legs amputated. So a young doctor came over to me, and he said, I'm going to try something new with you. I don't want to cut your legs off, unless I have to. I said, try whatever you want. He said, do you drink? And I said, no. I said, I had strict father. I never had coffee or tea before coming into the Army, let alone alcohol. He said, well, I'm going to prescribe an ounce of bourbon every hour for the next 12 hours. And I want to stimulate warmth from within you. and I'm going to move your bed over to the window and open the window so that you don't throw out too quickly, to see if that has an impact. Well, I don't know if that was correct medically or not. Thank heavens, my legs weren't amputated. When I got back to my unit after a month, I went up to the captain and I said, okay, you know that my legs were frozen. You know that I was sent for being wounded in action. Am I entitled to the Purple Heart? And he said, no, it has to be through a bullet hole or a shelling or bombing. I said, okay, and I was only 19. I said, fine, I respect what you tell me. About 10 years ago, one of my granddaughters said to me, talk to me about the war. Well, infantrymen don't like to talk about the war. But she said, give me one experience. So I told her about this. And when I finished, she was only about 12 at the time, she said, well, did you get a reward for that? An award for that? And I said, well, no. And she said, why not? And I said, the captain told me that you're not entitled to that. It's not considered to be wounded in action. She said, that can't be right. She said, write to the Secretary of the Army. So I wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Army, and I said, my granddaughter said that I should write to you. I said, I don't want anything I'm not entitled to. This is what happened. And as a 19-year-old, I believe that my captain knew what he was talking about. I got a letter back in several months, and they said, we're behind 3 years in reviewing these claims. So I wrote back and I said, do you realize that I'm in my 70s now, that 3 years from now, I just may not be around? Is there a way to expedite it for World War II veterans? 2 months later, I got a letter saying, your captain was wrong. You are entitled to the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star. So I got a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart just a few years ago. Senator Feinstein is a personal friend of mine, and she put this on my lapel, and Pregerson got me this little pin. I think World War II had a great part in changing the attitude of the people in the United States toward Hispanics. They had the opportunity, if you can call it that, to serve with people like me and other Hispanics. They realized that people who were Hispanics enlisted in the military in World War II at a higher rate than any other group. The number of people who died in combat were high among Hispanics, who were incredibly brave soldiers. The Purple Heart recipients, there's a high number who were Hispanics. So they got to realize that we were good Americans who believed in this country and believed in the principles of this country. And as things started to change in the 40s and 50s, and got to sit next to us and saw the children of World War II veterans who were loyal and good Americans who wanted to be successful as my children were in this country, they started accepting us as equals. Not over yet, but it's getting there. It's great to be an American of Hispanic descent.